Good evening, everyone. My name is Rawi Abdalal. I am the faculty director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies here at Harvard, and also a professor at Harvard Business School across the Charles River. Thank you for coming out tonight to engage in a community conversation. And we spent a lot of time trying to make sure that we described what we hoped would happen tonight carefully, and conversation is exactly what we hope to have. Tonight's event is organized by the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies together, along with co-sponsors, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature, the Minda-Gunsberg Center for European Studies, and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. The way we're going to organize this evening is I will share a few very brief remarks. Timish Olowinski, who is the executive director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, will share some remarks as well. And then we will have some brief panel presentations from colleagues who have graciously agreed to join us this evening. They will speak for about 5 minutes each. And then we will have an open discussion of some of the critical and often horrific events that we see unfolding before us. Some of you who may be in the room have graciously pre-submitted a number of questions for our panelists. And while we will not pose those questions verbatim to the panelists, all of our panelists have had a chance to look over them, and many of those questions had already been imagined as important ones to engage, and they will do their best to react to the questions that were submitted in advance. And so if you did so, thank you for that. I'd start by remarking on the obvious, which is that we all stand with the people of Ukraine who are enduring heroically, bravely, but with grave difficulty, a series of horrors of war. And unlike many wars that unfold in the world, we have been witness to events, sometimes in real time, in ways that are difficult for our own selves to endure. So we stand with the people of Ukraine, and this event is very much about the war in Ukraine and a conversation about perhaps some ways in which we can help, but certainly some ways in which we might be able to empathize deeply with what is going on with our friends in Ukraine. I'd also like to point out that the war in Ukraine touches many people around the world, none quite so deeply as Ukrainian citizens who are enduring this conflict, for sure, but others as well. And so I would like to note that there are many citizens of the Russian Federation who did not vote for this war, do not support this war, who will suffer negative consequences of this war. And in the interest of continuing to build our community here at Harvard, I note that we also empathize deeply with anyone who is suffering negative consequences of this conflict. This is not a time, at least in my assessment, to demonize a population because of the actions of their government. So everyone here as part of our community is welcome, and we hope to continue to build our community on the basis of mutual respect and empathy. We are, the panelists and I, scholars, academics, and we recognize that although we come from a perspective of our experience in the academy, of our decades worth of life invested in the study of the region. This is not an academic experience, though we are in the midst of the academy and we are ourselves all academics. This is deeply personal to all of us. Some of you were born in Ukraine or in other parts of the region. Some of you have family in Ukraine or in other parts of the region. Some of you have committed your scholarly careers to the region. So this is a very deeply personal event. And this is exactly why we wanted to call it a community conversation. It's not a series of presentations, it's a collection of reflections and an opportunity for us to talk together about what's going on. And also to let you know that for those of you who care deeply about what's going on in Ukraine, we do too. We do care very deeply as well. So I'd like to invite Timish Olewinski to share a few remarks, and then I will introduce our panelists and we will hear from them. Thank you, Timish.
Thank you, Rawi, for your remarks and your observations. I'm not going to add too much more because really what was already stated here is, I would just be echoing that in very many ways. But let me just quickly state that as the Ukrainian Research Institute here at Harvard, we hold ourselves out as a resource to this community, to the larger world as well. We have a dedicated staff who have been working on overload in response to this. We have great concerns. Many of our colleagues that we know are there. We're concerned for the students here, and as Rawi pointed out, all the students who are affected by this. For it is a larger population that will be affected. And this conflict will have ramifications not only for Eastern Europe, but I do feel for Europe in general, and certainly as we are living and witnessing ourselves to some extent for the United States. We don't know what the future will bring, and we're hopeful. For our part here, for the time being, we are working with our colleague centers and institutions to see what can be done to provide support, to provide perhaps emergency funding of some kind for scholars who are displaced, who need to come for a short period. These are all things that we're working on at the moment, not knowing what will happen from one day to the next. So I very much welcome all of you here for your desire to seek out information and to ask questions. And I'm grateful to the folks at the Davis Center for co-organizing this with us and for the support that has been offered by our fellow centers, but also by the whole larger Harvard community. It has been, needless to say, hard for us and difficult to focus on our daily tasks that we need to take care of. But it has been a great comfort to have the response, to have been on the receiving end of the support and for the sympathies that we have received thus far. So thank you and welcome, and I turn it over to our experts.
Thank you so much, Timish, and it's an honor and pleasure to be working closely with you during these difficult times, which we will, of course, continue to do. I would like to introduce briefly the members of our panel in the order in which they will be speaking. First will be Amelie Channel-Justice. She is the director of the Temerity Contemporary Ukraine program at the Ukrainian Research Institute. She's a socio-cultural anthropologist who has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the City University of New York, and she will be speaking about the recent history and, we hope, not too fragile sovereignty of Ukraine. Tom Remington will be next. He is a visiting professor of government at Harvard, a Davis Center Associate, and the Goodrich C. White Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Emory University. His current research addresses the formation of social policy in Russia and China, and he will be speaking about Russia's foreign policy goals and what the president of the Russian Federation might be thinking, and also what the government in Beijing might do next with regards to its involvement in the conflict. After Tom will be Ole Katsuba. He is the manager of publications at the Ukrainian Research Institute. He holds a PhD in Slavic languages and literature from Harvard. His research focuses on literature that struggles to come to terms with the experience of living in authoritarian contexts, regrettably ever more relevant to our times, and focusing primarily on 20th century and contemporary Russian, Ukrainian, and East European literatures and cultures. He will be talking about the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. After Ole will be Mariana Bujerin, who is a research associate at the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School and a former fellow of the Davis Center. She holds a PhD in political science from Central European University in Budapest. Her research focuses on the international non-proliferation regime, arms control, and post-Soviet nuclear history. Her new book, entitled Inheriting the Bomb, Soviet Collapse and Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine, was released just this month. So she will be, of course, speaking about the terrifying nuclear element of the current crisis. After Mariana will be Alexander Vacru, who is the executive director of the Davis Center, a lecturer in the government department here at Harvard, and writes and speaks about contemporary Eurasian politics. She will be talking about sanctions and the economic impact of the war on Russia, and as well whether that economic impact is likely to change the decision-making in the Kremlin about how the war might unfold. And then finally, Oksana Shevel, who is an assistant professor of political science at Tufts University. She holds a PhD in government from Harvard. Her research and teaching focus on the post-communist region generally, and as well specifically on nation and state building in the region, the politics of citizenship, of migration, of memory, and of religious politics, as well as the challenges to democratization in the post-Soviet space. She is an associate of both the Davis Center and the Ukrainian Research Institute, and she will be speaking briefly about the international response to the crisis and how and when the crisis might end. Each of our panelists will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we will open the floor for discussion. If you have not noticed, there are 2 microphones in the back of the room, and so I invite you, when you are ready for your question to be posed or your remarks to be shared, to make your way back to one of the microphones so that we up here and all of us in the room can hear you. So with that, let's start with Emily. You can do whatever you want.
Why don't you?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Robbie, and thanks everyone for being here. I think we all realize what a significant moment this is, and so it's nice to see a lot of folks who are interested in having this conversation. I think it's important to just start out by saying, there's a lot. This is a very fluid situation. There's a lot that we don't know, and I think there's also a lot that we don't know yet, and so it's really important to keep in mind that the topics that we discussed today could shift very significantly, in 24 hours. So I'll start with a couple. I think I'll use my time to just talk through a couple of significant time periods in Ukraine. Obviously, We who study Ukraine know that Ukraine's history is much more recent than its sovereignty, its post-Soviet sovereignty that happened in 1991. But I'll start with 1991. This is when Ukraine becomes independent from the Soviet Union. The reason that this year is so significant in part is because of the way that the country, the contemporary territory of Ukraine becomes a state. And what makes this significant is that Ukraine becomes made up of citizens based on who lives in the territory of Ukraine. Those of us who study the region know it as a civic nation. That's the terminology we like to use, and it really just means that anybody who lives in Ukraine is a citizen of Ukraine. And this is distinct from a lot of our contemporary nation states where one's nationality or national identity is what contributes to the formation of that state. And that's very unique in Ukraine, and I think that made Ukrainian identity in the contemporary world very unique because it meant that Ukrainian people of Ukrainian ethnicity and Ukrainian speakers could live alongside people who were Russian ethnicity and Russian speakers, and all of those people could be Ukrainian, and that's not even to talk about the very multi-ethnic nature of Ukraine. It includes lots of minorities as well, which is worth talking about in the Q&A if anyone's interested. So I just think that sets the stage. The idea of Ukraine is kind of, it's obviously, a recent country, but the background of becoming a state kind of matters in this discussion, especially if we're talking about how sovereignty works. And I'll fast forward quite a bit to 2013 and 2014, which I think is a particularly significant time period because it secures the direction of Ukraine, the Ukraine that we're seeing now. So this is the time of the Euromaidan protests. We have a pro-Russian president who wasn't that pro-Russian when he was elected, but turned pro-Russian in 2013. And the people in Ukraine came out into the streets. They decided they wanted to make sure Ukraine went in a European direction, ousted that president. We know 100 protesters died in that uprising. But this moment is really significant, not only because of what people were willing to give up in order to secure Ukraine's European future, but because it really sets Ukraine on a path toward the kind of democracy that I think is so threatening to Vladimir Putin, that has sort of been the backdrop of a lot of what we're seeing now. So after the Euromaidan protests, we get new elections and a very kind of European integration orientation. We also know that a lot of the reforms that Ukraine needs to complete in order to join the EU, in order to join NATO, are very far away. Ukraine has not, in terms of domestic politics, there's a lot of work to be done to get Ukraine to the standards that is necessary to be part of the EU. But I just kind of want us to recognize that work that was being done since 2014. That's really significant in terms of the way Ukraine developed as a democracy and the way that people were increasingly oriented toward a Ukrainian identity that has become stronger since 2014. And of course, the other element of 2014 that's really essential is the occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia, and then the ensuing invasion of eastern Ukraine by Russia in later of 2014. Obviously, these events certainly impacted, again, the orientation of Ukrainians toward a Ukrainian identity and kind of more away from Russia. And then the last thing I want to mention, obviously Ukraine's been at war for 8 years and none of its leaders have succeeded in really advancing significantly toward peace. But it's important that in 2019, we all remember one of the first events I attended when I started here was the event about President Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky, a comedian who became president in a very odd, turning TV into life. The plot of his TV show was that he was an ordinary history teacher who got elected president, and that's kind of what happened. But I think that this is significant now because, and this is one of those things that you realize in retrospect, there's been a lot of criticism of him for not really being prepared, not being able to accomplish a lot of his goals. But I think what's important is that he came from very far outside of the existing political establishment in Ukraine. He didn't come up with any of the existing parties. He wasn't affiliated with any of the previous rulers, right? He really was elected with almost 75% of the vote in Ukraine. And then he oriented Ukraine towards certain reforms that previous presidents hadn't done. And I'm not trying to glorify anything that he's done. I think some of what he did was good and some of what he did needed work. But I do think that his election was an indication of a different level of democracy in Ukraine, where you actually had somebody who you couldn't have predicted would become president, winning a very large proportion of the vote, and then remaining reasonably popular through the first year of his term. And I think those things are important to remember because they really show Ukraine moving in a direction, not being perfect, right? Not doing anything in an ideal way, but moving in a particular direction that is completely the opposite direction of the Russian Federation, which has become more isolated and more autocratic and less oriented toward the world. And I think that what we're seeing now is a kind of confluence of all of these factors coming together, where Vladimir Putin has clearly, this is more of a threat to him than previous democratic elections in Ukraine were. So not to say that this was, predictable or we should certainly, I don't know. I mean, there were people who thought that this is how this would go, and people who disagreed, and not to say that one group was right or another, but it does seem now that there's been this kind of, leading up to this moment, that some of these factors over the past 30 years of Ukraine's independence clearly indicate that there would be a breaking point for Vladimir Putin, and that is unfortunately where we are. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. Tom, you're up.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on this panel, and tragic that we are on this panel. I'll make 4 points and try to be brief. I want to address the question that has come up quite a bit. Has Putin changed? Have his goals changed? Has his personality changed? I'd say Putin has changed in his personality. I'd say his regime has changed. It's become more personalist. So there are fewer constraints, especially since 2011, than there were at the outset. He personally has become less cautious. You may remember in that funny sort of memoir, first person, he records that his KGB trainers said of him he had this personality flaw, that he had an insufficient appreciation of danger. So the cockiness that we've observed in him has grown more pronounced over time. I think his agenda has changed, and I think part of it has to do not only with the poor foreign policy advice he's been getting about how weak Western unity was. The EU, his advisors thought was kind of a joke, but also by the experience of the Georgia war in 2008 and the relative ease with which he seized Crimea and supported separatists in the two eastern regions. So I think his calculations changed, and those led to what is for him a disastrous miscalculation in the outset of his operation. How will this affect Russians? Alexander will speak more on this. I would say that the effects of the sanctions have both short-term, fairly severe consequences, and will have more consequences over the middle and longer term. We're already seeing significant economic disruptions. Russians are acutely sensitive to inflation, more than the United States populace is right now, including prices at the gasoline pump and food prices, and they are going up very rapidly. As you're reading, Russians can't get hard currency out of their bank accounts, and the ruble is trading at an extraordinarily low level, which means the price of anything imported, whether it's for consumers or it's spare parts or intermediate goods for manufacturing, all those prices are skyrocketing. So the so-called middle class, which is a pretty amorphous group, is already feeling the effects. They can't travel, can't access their hard currency accounts. The comforts they were used to are rapidly drying up. I think supply chains, I'd be interested in knowing what Ravi would say, but I think supply chains, we've been seeing this decoupling between the US and China with respect to the supply of critical components like chips for automobile manufacturing. The disruption for Russia is much more severe and much more sudden. This will affect domestic air transportation because Boeing and Airbus have both said they won't be supplying any spare parts to the air fleet. Inputs for making pharmaceuticals, a lot of the inputs, the manufactured goods that they need to make finished pharmaceuticals are imported. Those are going to be drying up. The so-called oligarchs are already suffering, and all of the members of the Federation Council, who also are well-established figures, some of them rich businessmen, some of them established politicians, are under the sanctions. There have been reasonably widespread political protests. A very large number, many, many dozens of cities have seen protests, particularly on Sunday, very widespread. Maybe not as widespread as the protests over the treatment of Navalny, but it suggests that there is an articulate and educated segment of the population in many cities who are outraged, humiliated, shocked, grieved at what their government is doing. What that makes me think is there could be a crisis of governability, and the security forces, the so-called CDK, less the military, in my opinion, than the former KGB kinds of folks, FSB and others, who are responsible for maintaining political order, political stability. They must be worrying about the consequences of a breakdown of political order. For example, what if there were bread riots or gasoline riots? What are the possible outcomes of this? Efforts at diplomacy are already becoming more active. Yesterday, President Zelensky posted to his presidential website what I think is a fairly significant statement indicating a Ukrainian willingness to think about discussing arrangements that would affect the two eastern provinces and even Crimea. This suggests to me an opening that could be the basis for some kind of negotiation, such as will begin tomorrow in Antalya. And I gather that the Israeli Prime Minister has been kind of shuttling back and forth on the phone between Russian and Ukrainian counterparts. I think China has remained completely in the background. But the statement that President Zelensky issued was immediately picked up by the Chinese official news agency Xinhua, suggesting attentiveness to a possible diplomatic outcome. What could be a solution? Some have thought there could be a partition like Cyprus in 1974 or Bosnia-Herzegovina or France in World War II. I note that Spain is considered to be a unitary country made up of autonomous communities. So the relative cultural autonomy of Catalonia reflects its status as an autonomous community, and I can't help but wonder whether there might not be a legal formula that would ultimately be satisfactory as an outcome to this war. Another possible outcome is some kind of a semi-coup in Russia, maybe not immediately, but I note a number of precedents for that. The conspiracy by senior political leaders against Beria in '53 to make sure he wouldn't be a threat. Conspiracy, obviously, to remove Khrushchev in 1964. I frankly think that there was something like that to remove Yeltsin in 1999 that brought Putin to power. If the alternative is maintaining order without the person at the top, then it seems to me influential people might so conspire. Another example, of course, is the so-called putsch against Gorbachev in '91, which fell apart. The fourth point I want to make is, maybe it seems self-evident, why would the world care about this war? Massive humanitarian disaster is self-evident. The framing in much of the press commentary is it's a confrontation of democracy and dictatorship. Of course, that's the case. There's something else at work here, and that is how fundamental a violation this is of the most basic principles of international order. So a day or two ago, the Singaporean foreign minister, Singapore known for not valuing democratic values at all, Singapore's foreign minister explained why his country is also joining in the sanctions regime. He said, this is an existential issue for us. Ukraine is much smaller than Russia, but it is much bigger than Singapore. A world order based on might is right would be profoundly inimical in security to the survival of small states. That fundamental point, and maybe it's self-evident, helps explain why so many countries, including non-democracies, are joining into the international sanctions regime. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Ollie?
Thank you. This is a personal issue to me in many ways. I was born and raised in Ukraine, and I left when I was 19, and so I have many relatives, friends, colleagues who are still in Ukraine as we speak. My family, part of it, are in Mykolaiv and have been sheltering for many days at this point in a damp basement, listening to the explosions of the bombs in residential neighborhoods, and refusing to leave because they don't want to be beggars in someone else's country. They have worked their entire lives to try and build up something for themselves, and now they would be forced to abandon all of it. So they're staying there, and they say that they would, if it comes to pass, they would die there. And it's, as you can imagine, this is something that is very difficult to deal with when you message with people, when you talk with them, and then when you see the images of so many more people who have already left the country or who have been internally displaced. So far, over 2 million people have already left Ukraine, and over 1.5 million people have become internally displaced. Just think about these numbers. These numbers are just unimaginable. If you think of Boston having a population of 800,000 people, how many Bostons have disappeared at this point? We don't know if these people are ever going to come back. According to the UN Human Rights Office, as of today, 474 civilians have been killed and 861 injured. Of them, 40 children have been killed. The real losses are almost certainly a lot higher. Only today, the most recent reports from the mayor of the city of Mariupol on the south of Ukraine, on the Black Sea coast, on the Azov Sea coast, he states that over 1,300 civilians have been killed in that city alone. The shellings that incurred those deaths have been indiscriminate shelling by Russian forces of residential neighborhoods. There are currently photos circulating on social media by journalists who work in the city of corpses lying in the streets, and there's no one to pick them up, and also because the shelling continues. People are looting the stores, trying to find any food or water they can get, as well as medications. As of right now, by the presidential decree, only women and children are allowed to leave. Men aged 18 through 60 are required to stay in the country in case they're needed to defend the country. According to various reports, about 140,000 men have returned to the country from abroad to join the Ukrainian Defense Forces. In recent days, the consideration of the actions of Russian military and President Putin personally as war crimes and crimes against humanity have been mentioned in various reports. Although the possibility of bringing Putin personally to justice seems very remote, perhaps even unrealistic, I think that it is symbolically extremely important to speak about the nature of what is going on in Ukraine right now. In particular, Russia has been shelling residential neighborhoods, and that leads to civilian casualties. No humanitarian corridors were allowed for a long time. Today was in fact the first such limited occurrence, which led to further casualties. There has been shelling and capture of nuclear power plants, as we are having this conversation today, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant is without electricity. According to the Ukrainian state nuclear authorities, the peak temperature at the power plant will be reached in 7 days. At that point, another nuclear disaster is possible. Finally, there has been shelling of hospitals, including children's hospitals and maternity wards, killing many patients in them, as well as of schools and kindergartens. People who have survived the shelling at Bucha, Irpin, Vorzel, Borodyanka have reported that Russian soldiers have behaved in the most horrendous way, and they have, so this is unconfirmed reports, but they have claimed that there has been rape, there has been shooting at blank point of people. We know that the mayor of Bucha was shot when he was distributing medications and food to local residents who are particularly vulnerable. So who are especially vulnerable in such a situation, as in any war? Of course, the first are children, who, especially if they get trapped under rubble, cannot help themselves. There has been a case when a child has died of dehydration. Then there are the elderly, those who cannot move by themselves, who cannot leave the zone of the active military campaign by themselves, or maybe who don't have anyone to help them get out. There are the poor, people who cannot afford to go anywhere, who don't have a car or who don't have other means to get to the next possible point where they could be evacuated from the zone of war. There are also the ethnic, sexual, and racial minorities. As in any conflict, tensions escalate when people are fearing for their lives. Finally, various groups that hold professions such as ours, scholars, writers, artists, who don't hold a trade that could help them survive in some other country easily, they all are at risk, and the risks are severe. What are people that we know, that I know, friends, family, and colleagues saying on the ground? And I have been trying to stay in touch as much as possible, although, as you may know, the connections are also impacted. Most people don't want to leave. They're trying to stay and hold on as much as possible. They want to stay in their homes. People are furious with Putin, and also with those Russians who have not actively opposed Putin's regime in Russia, thus allowing him to build a system without any checks and balances, with almost unlimited power controlled by one man on top of the power pyramid. People on the ground say that Ukrainians will never surrender. And from what we have heard, Putin will only cease his criminal attacks on Ukraine once Ukraine completely surrenders. Even if political leadership gives in under Western or Russian pressure, and both are in play here, we need to remember, most people will not accept any such compromise and will fight to the end. Why? Number one, what people say is that Putin does not seem interested in simply carving out a piece of Ukrainian territory. Otherwise, he would have kept Crimea and the parts of Donbass. Basically, for him, only a complete annihilation of Ukraine as an idea will be satisfactory. Number two, there is no way to engage in a negotiation, which is a rational process, with someone whose main condition is that you are dead. Number three, what would Russia bring to Ukraine if Ukraine gave up? Stanislav Aseyev, in his recent book, In Isolation, Dispatches from Occupied Donbass, has vividly described that when he stayed on the ground in the occupied territories of Donbass. Russia brings lawlessness, unregulated violence, corruption, and complete disenfranchisement of regular citizens from those ruling over them. This is not what Ukraine wants, and everyone understands that. I have a few copies of the book here. These are advanced copies. If someone is interested, I'm happy to make them available for free. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oleg. Mariana?
Oh, is it my turn? Gosh. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this. To add to Oleg's talk, before I launch into the nuclear dimension of this crisis, is just to emphasize that the story of Ukraine today is not only the story of terrible victimization, it is the story of incredible courage and incredible defiance across all people of all sorts of walk, of people who speak, whether they speak Ukrainian or Russian, whether they're men or women, whether they're able to fight with weapons or they're not, and then they're volunteering to provide refugee relief in Western cities. They're transmitting information to the West or otherwise. This is an incredible thing, actually, to behold. I have never seen anything like that, and maybe a small preview during the Maidan, but this is something, many, many times more powerful than that. And, one hopes that in the world of sort of pervasive cynicism and relativism, watching these events from outside, one can find inspiration even in such desperate times. So this is just what I want us to recognize as well, in addition to, of course, recognizing the terrible humanitarian situation. I will speak now to the nuclear dimension of this crisis, and there are several nuclear elements or nuclear points that I would like to make. One is Ukraine's own nuclear history. As many of us have probably heard at some point, Ukraine has inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal from the collapsed Soviet Union. This is the simplified version. The more complicated version will be coming out in my book. But what we need to keep in mind is that there's nuance to the story. Ukraine did not actually inherit a functional deterrent. It did inherit, however, a nuclear option. It was not a non-choice, as some, I hear people all the time kind of discussing this in the field. Ukraine did have agency in the matter. It did have choices, and it made the correct choice. It made the right choice at the time, which was to disarm, to dismantle the infrastructure, and to transfer all the warheads to Russia. In exchange, it got a deal. Part of the deal was financial compensation for the value of fissile materials, uranium, plutonium contained in these warheads. And the other part of the deal were the security assurances given to Ukraine by the three depository states of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And those are the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Russian Federation. This document was signed in 1994. We know it now as the Budapest Memorandum. And this Budapest Memorandum recorded the obligation of these three nuclear states to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, not to threaten it with force or use force against it. It is very clear that in 2014, the document was very glibly and brutally violated by the Russian Federation. And now, this is triple the offense, if one is counting. So what does it mean then? If a country voluntarily disarms, if it goes along with the international non-proliferation regime, joins the international community in good terms, allegedly contributes to the overall security, international security, by reducing the number of nuclear weapons in the world. should it then be punished and put its own security in peril, as it were? And should the breaches of the security commitments by the nuclear states, go? How should we treat it within the frames of the international non-proliferation regime? Clearly, some of the core bargains, some of the core sort of understandings and norms at the center of the international non-proliferation regime that strives to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world have been severely undermined. And I can only imagine what potential proliferators out there in the world will think, looking at Ukraine's example, especially given that in public discourse there's very little room for nuance. So now the narrative, the general narrative, is there were nuclear weapons, they were given up, and now look what happened. Right? None of this is good, bottom line, for the non-proliferation. The second nuclear dimension, or nuclear point, is that of nuclear deterrence and strategic stability, which is to say the relationship between two nuclear blocs, the United States and its NATO allies, and NATO is a nuclear alliance, and Russia on the other side. Right? So there has been, this relationship has emerged still back in the Cold War, during the Soviet days, where it's a sort of bilateral set of understandings, again, about how two nuclear superpowers should be relating to each other, what nuclear deterrence entails, how do you operate in that environment. What we see going on right now is that on the day 4 of war with Ukraine, Putin is not at all embarrassed or ashamed or holds back from issuing nuclear threats, right? These nuclear threats are directed first and foremost to NATO and the United States, and they mean stay away, do not get involved in the Ukrainian conflict. I don't think there was, even without those explicit threats, much chance of that happening. But the fact that he so easily resorts to this nuclear saber rattling is really worrying, right? Because he seems to be able to think that he could escalate simply because, he can issue the deterrent threats and everyone will stay away. And the thing is, it's working. The West is deterred. The West will not, contemplate, the West is extremely careful about considering the no-fly zone or the supply of any sort of bigger weapon systems, right? The risk threshold is a lot lower on the Western part than it is on the Russian side. And so it raises very interesting questions as to exactly how nuclear deterrence operates in this very uneven, very asymmetrical threat tolerance and, kind of the socio-psychological environment. And a third nuclear element is that of the safety and security of civilian nuclear infrastructure. Oleg already mentioned Chernobyl exclusion zone, Chernobyl decommissioned, Chernobyl nuclear power plant has been seized. Now we know that there's no electricity. It's been cut off from electricity. As someone who deals a little bit with these issues, I'm not a physicist. I just listen to people who know better. There is an imminent risk right now, but this should not give us, put us in a complacent place. The spent nuclear fuel that is at Chernobyl has been cooling for about 20 years, right? It's spent fuel. It's not as active. It's not as hot. Even if the water, kind of boils out, we're talking about maybe weeks. Although Oleg cited 7 days. The point here is this is unprecedented. No safety and security system on a civilian nuclear facility has been designed to withstand a full-scale war. Right now, before I came here, we're on this email chain with a bunch of nuclear physicists at Princeton, at Stanford, at MIT, doing calculations on the back of the envelope. how much fuel, what is the radioactivity of it, how long will it take for the water to boil out, and once the water boils out, how long for the temperature to go above 300 degrees Celsius when the meltdown could begin, and then what it means. We're doing these calculations now on the back of the envelope because nobody could foresee a situation like that. I'm much more concerned about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The reactors have just recently been operating. You don't switch a nuclear power plant just like that. The fuel in the core remains very active and very high energy for a while. It needs cooling. Even when it's taken out after a couple of weeks, it needs to cool in the spent fuel ponds. Then again, all of these systems rely on the cooling system, on the supply of water, the working of the pumps, and electricity supply, right? These are very highly secured facilities. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has been very diligent. Ukraine has cooperated for decades with it, trying to improve safety and security. None of the protocols have been designed with that kind of threat in mind. And that brings me to the fact that, back in 2009, the IAEA had unanimously adopted a decision, and unanimously meaning the Russian Federation was part of it. The Russian Federation is one of the founders, one of the key stakeholders in this nuclear governance regime, that any use of armed force or even a threat of armed force against a civilian nuclear facility, such as the nuclear power plant, constitutes a breach of UN Charter. It violates international law. So, sort of to conclude all of this, we're now looking at the world, and this is what Timish said, this goes beyond Ukraine, and it goes beyond the region. And at least in this nuclear dimension, it goes to the international regimes and governance systems that we as international community have painstakingly built in the post-World War II era to try for us to become, find better ways of living together, as nation states than just, might as right, as Tom pointed out, that Singapore is concerned about. And the point there is that the Soviet Union and then Russia, as one of the successor states, the major successor state of the Soviet Union, has been a stakeholder. Even in the coldest times of the Cold War, it has been a stakeholder and a very major player in trying to build up these international institutions, the IAEA, the nuclear non-proliferation regime, and so forth. And we are faced in a situation now where that major player, that major stakeholder has gone rogue. And I think we as scholars, as practitioners of politics, as policymakers, have a reckoning coming to think exactly how do we go forward from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Alexandra.
Thank you. So I've been asked to talk about the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia since the invasion of Ukraine. And there's a lot to cover. I'll speak a little bit quickly, although probably not as fast as Oksana, so it will be a good warm-up. And I want to talk about three things, as Rawi suggested. First, an overview of what the sanctions are. Secondly, the impact of the economic sanctions, and then how it might or might not affect the calculus that Putin is making. So in terms of the sanctions, we've all been seeing a lot about it. They've been continuing to increase, so it's very hard to keep track of what's been imposed. But I can say for sure that we have never seen anything like it. Russia is the 11th largest economy in the world. And the other countries that have been sanctioned like this, and actually no one has been sanctioned to this extent, have been tiny compared to Russia. Syria, Iran, Venezuela, they are not integrated into the global economy the same way that Russia is. So the sanctions have taken a couple different forms. The one that we've heard the most about is on banks. And these have a couple different elements. So one is that the banks have been de-SWIFTified, or the largest banks, which means that they can no longer exchange email messages with one another to let people know or let the other banks know when transactions and money is coming and going. And we thought that was the nuclear option. Sorry, Mariana, but in fact, it's not the nuclear option. The nuclear option was freezing the central bank's reserves and sanctioning the central bank. And so even though Vladimir Putin had built up $640 billion in reserves that he was planning on saving for this rainy day, he can't access at least half of that. And that's what he was counting on to prop up the ruble and to mitigate some of the effects of being cut off from SWIFT and potentially cut off of the dollar. Now, cutting banks off of the dollar is fairly easy for the United States to do because of the correspondent bank system. So almost 80%, 88% of global transactions, even ones that don't directly involve the dollar, actually go through the dollar through correspondent banks in New York. So someone in Japan buying something in Germany, their banks have correspondent bank accounts in New York, and that's actually where the money changes hands. And so if you can't do that and you can't use the dollar, the guy in Japan can't buy the thing in Germany. And now the Russian banks that are sanctioned have been cut off from those correspondent banks. So that's extremely significant as well. The other second major category, which Tom alluded to, are export controls. So Russia does produce some things. They assemble cars, for example, but they assemble cars from parts that are imported from other parts of the world. And they are no longer going to be getting those parts. They're no longer going to be getting them because they can't afford to buy them, and they have no way of paying for them, and because they have no way of getting them now that the main container shipping companies have refused to take cargo in or out of Russia. The other major impact is going to be, as Tom suggested, on avionics and airplanes. Russia has an enormous number of leased airplanes, which it is not going to be able to service because it won't get spare parts and because it cannot insure them. And if they can't be insured, they can't fly. The third part of the sanctions are individuals. There's actually an enormous number of individuals that have been sanctioned. That is the biggest, if you're measuring the sanctions one by one, the biggest category of sanctions are on different individuals. So they're no longer allowed to have their correspondent bank accounts or do those transactions. We know that their yachts are being taken away. Supposedly they've put a lot of their money into Bitcoin and are drinking vodka in Dubai, talking about how clever they are. But it's not clear how they're going to convert that Bitcoin back into money that they can actually spend. And then finally, we're seeing a lot of self-sanctioning from corporates. So you saw probably today that Coca-Cola and McDonald's and Pizza Hut and all of those companies are going to shut down their operations in Moscow. There are over 200 big international companies that have said that they're leaving the Russian market. I don't know if it's totally leaving or suspending, but that is going to have a huge impact also on the Russian retail sector. The one thing that hasn't been sanctioned is that there have been carve-outs for the oil and gas industry. And that's extremely important because Europe is highly dependent on Russian oil and gas. And they cannot afford not to be heating their houses. So there's a lot of scrambling right now to think about how we could replace 10% of our oil supply, which comes from Russia. That's already not so easy to do, certainly not easy to do in the short term. But it is impossible for Europe to replace in a period of, let's say, 6 to 12 months, the amount of oil and gas that they're getting from Russia. So there are carve-outs, and even the sanctioned banks are allowed to do transactions if they involve the purchase of oil and gas. And it's not a trivial amount of money. Right? On March 3rd alone, for example, Russia received $720 million from Europe for payment for gas. So it's a significant amount of money. Now, the economic impact is unknown. We're running an enormous experiment on what happens when you try and unplug an economy from the global market. Russia is more isolated than a lot of other countries, in part because sanctions began to be imposed in 2014. But nonetheless, this is going to be an enormous hit. I saw one estimate today that GDP could drop 30%. That seems to be a little bit high, but that's the Great Depression, basically, level. But I'd say at least 15% is pretty likely. And if we look at the domestic impact in the short term, the ruble has dropped about 40%. The stock market is closed and may reopen next week, but everyone is terrified to see what happens to it at that point. There has not been a bank run because the Central Bank of Russia, which is actually an extremely well-run central bank, had been able to stockpile cash and make it available to banks so that the ATMs would not run dry. I don't know how long that will last, but that was actually a very important step for them to do on the Monday after the invasion. In terms of the international effect, there are many, and we don't know all of them. One is that Russia is potentially defaulting on its sovereign debt on March 16th when the next payment comes due. That hasn't happened since 1998, and in 1998 it was the cause of a big collapse in Russia. Here it's actually a symptom or an effect of something else that's happening. We're also going to see a fall in wheat exports. Russia is a major wheat exporter. Russia and Ukraine together exported 30% of global wheat through the Black Sea. Ukraine's exports are probably not going to happen next year, which means that we're going to be seeing potentially famine in Africa and in other countries that depend on those exports. Russia is managing to shift some of its sales to China, even though China has always been worried about this fungus that's in Russian wheat, but the Chinese have been quite good at negotiating preferential prices. So the Russians may find a market, but they're not going to be getting the kinds of prices that they were getting before. The other thing is that there are quite a lot of commodities and raw materials that Russia exports, not the least of which is fertilizer. So again, if we're thinking of the potential global agricultural impact, the fact that there's not going to be Russian fertilizer exports is going to make a difference around the world. And then there are oil prices. Right? We've already seen a big increase in oil prices. I think we can expect to see more of that. It's very difficult to increase supply. You can't do it quickly, and we can expect to see an increase both in the oil and the gas prices. So then finally, the question is, will this actually affect Putin's calculation? And we did a panel on sanctions on Tuesday, and I asked someone who worked for Treasury, like, what's the theory of sanctions? Like, you're trying to punish someone, but are you thinking that the population is going to be so hurt that they're going to revolt and change the government? Or are you thinking that the oligarchs are going to get so upset that they no longer have their money, that they're going to turn against Putin? Like, what's the theory here? And the guy who worked at Treasury said, actually, it's not supposed to be either of those things, right? It's supposed to be like a dial. So we're punishing Russia, but if they do something that they're supposed to do, then we could let up on the sanctions. The problem is that we never actually lift sanctions, right? Or at least that's the way the Russians see it. So once those sanctions are imposed, and certainly once they're legislated, they're basically not going to get lifted. And so the Russians see them as a punishment for sure, but they're not going to incentivize Putin to change his calculations or change his behavior in the hopes that some of those sanctions will be lifted. And as for whether or not they're going to cause political pressure on him, maybe over the medium or the long term they might when the economic situation gets really bad, but I haven't seen any signs in the short term that there's going to be enough people on the street protesting at great risk to themselves to create some kind of political mobilization that's threatening to him, and the oligarchs have been very quiet. After the first three came out against the war, nobody else has said anything. For them to speak out means that they would probably be like Khodorkovsky, sewing mittens for 10 years in a penal colony, and everyone knows it. So I don't think that that's where we're going to find the source of change for Putin's policy.
Okay, thank you. Going last, there is a lot of things that I was going to say but already said, but I will make a few points on the questions that Ravi posed about Western reaction and sort of likely and less likely scenarios for how things might unfold in Ukraine. So for the Western reaction, I guess I would make 2 points there. One is that something that Ukrainians have been emphasizing, and I don't think it's quite fully maybe registered in the West, or maybe not everybody in the West agrees with it, that Western reaction has been very reactive rather than proactive, right? So the things that Putin has been doing since 2014, and according to some, been warnings about basically where this imperial-oriented authoritarianism might lead, that the Baltic countries and the Poland and sort of other countries that suffered from Soviet rule before have been warning, kind of went unheeded, right? It was sort of, if you say that, you are either Russophobe or you are nationalist or some combination thereof, right? So I think there is a lot of frustration, and of course a lot of the things that now have been imposed, from the sanctions to, say, the stop of the Nord Stream, to additional military aid. If you talk to people in Ukraine, you hear what they're saying, and I think they have a point here. Like this is a Western reaction. Again, is there an expectation in the West that somehow, maybe Putin doesn't really mean what he says, or maybe he's going to stop with Ukraine, or maybe it's not sort of global danger, and it's somehow local conflict, and already Tom made some points how it is really broader than just about Ukraine. So I think what we are now seeing, the two sort of, I mean, the no-fly zone is one thing that seems to be going nowhere, but of course there are additional things that might prevent a civilian catastrophe that's unfolding with this carpet bombing of the cities, from additional air defense, right, to airplanes, to the West potentially trying to find ways to cut itself from purchases of Russian oil and energy that they get money for, right? So this, sort of the way I see it, it's sort of a race against time, because if these things happen before there is greater destruction in Ukraine, the more likely it is that this, both civilian catastrophe and potentially even worse things could be prevented if we speak about global politics. So for the Western response, I think it has been important. Obviously, Ukraine needs, the weaponry that it has to fight. But it is at the same time has been much more reactive than proactive, and I think there is some reckoning to be done in the West to think about what is it really about, right? Can you really sort of sit it out? Can you hope that it's going to end with Ukraine, and that that's sort of where it ends, and we can go back to our kind of comforts of our life, right? So that would be one thing that I would just want to put on the table. We can discuss it further. Now, another thing that I want to talk about, and this brings us to this broader issue of likely more and less likely scenarios for Ukraine. I think it is very clear, and this is something, if you haven't read Putin's pre-invasion speech, I certainly encourage you to read or listen to it. What is it really about? It is not about NATO. It is not about these republics. I think these are red herrings, because I can mention just a few things. Ukraine was not in NATO. It wasn't going to get in NATO. There was no consensus within NATO. There was Orban who was going to veto it no matter what, right? France, Germany, and before 2014 invasion, there was no consensus within Ukraine about it, right? So this whole thing that it is somehow like, if only, West gave Ukraine, promised that Ukraine won't be in NATO, none of this would happen, I think that's fundamentally wrong. So I'll just, put that on the table. It is also not about the recognition of these so-called republics in the East, because Putin already controlled this territory, right? So if what they wanted was, protect Russian speakers in these republics from genocide, as they called, right, or control Crimea, Ukraine was not going to go try to take militarily Crimea. It wasn't going to go try to attack, this rebel-controlled eastern Ukrainian regions to liberate them. Like, that's also completely red herring. So I don't see sort of like, if this were to be the settlement, that Ukraine were somehow to say like, oh, okay, we agree that Russia holds Crimea. I don't think that's what Putin wants. I mean, if that's what he wanted, like, what was the point of invading and having all these thousands of people killed on Russian side? I just don't see that. But what I do see, and I think this is very important for everybody to realize, what are really the end goals there? Oleg and others already said, the goal is really destruction of Ukraine as a sovereign state. It is no less than that. If you read his pre-invasion speech, he talks about denazification, right? He talks about demilitarization. So basically, anything that Ukraine could do as a sovereign state, be it from pursuing, say, memory politics that question Soviet reading of history, that's Nazification. So subjects of Nazification wouldn't be just like the Azov battalion or whatever far-right groups exist in Ukraine. It's civil society activists, it's scholars, it's basically anybody who doesn't agree with Putin. So if he gets to control any part of Ukraine, there would be massive repression, there would be massive reprisal, the death toll would be higher than what it is now. So any sort of this sort of like, let's give him have some settlement where part of the country is controlled by Russia, and that's somehow stable outcome, it isn't. So really, the goal is nothing less than destruction of Ukraine as a sovereign state. That's exactly what demilitarization is, right? Okay, Ukraine may not be in NATO, as President said, Zelensky said, this is sort of not an end goal in itself, maybe, but it does have to have security guarantees. Would Putin agree to have Ukraine have a functioning army? No, of course, because then he can't, control the country, he can't attack it. So NATO, again, is like, I mean, I don't know how better to describe it than the red herring. Now, so with this in mind, sort of what are the possibilities there? Again, as Oleg said already, Ukrainians are determined to fight exactly because they see it as an existential fight for survival. It is not about some sort of, I don't know, it's hard, I think, for all of us. And I mean, I am sort of torn here because I am Ukrainian, I have family in Ukraine, I am still Ukrainian citizen, right? Like, I don't know what I would do if I were in this, if I actually lived in Ukraine. But I talk to people, from family to friends to, of course, you see the video, people are determined to fight and die because they don't want to live as slaves. It's sort of as simple as that, as fundamental as that. So any kind of, setup where, say, Russia gets to control some part of this territory, there would be constant insurgency there. There would be constant human rights violations. So I don't think it's a viable option. Furthermore, and I think that's an important analytical point, I don't think Russia has the capacity to do this. Think about what they've accomplished so far, right? They moved into the territories, which are supposed to be the most Russia-friendly, right? Russian-speaking, southern, eastern Ukraine. We have people coming on the street yelling at them in Russian, right? So this sort of national unity that this invasion created surpasses anything. Like in some sort of perverse, ironic sense, Putin is nation building in Ukraine like no nationalist ever could, right? He's sort of bringing his own fears to reality, right? So, and I think this is hugely important because to control this territory, right, they're now taking what, like one region, one oblast center. There are 26 of them, right, or 24, how many we have. So the commitment of the military might of sort of personnel to actually control and occupy this. There can't be no puppet government. That puppet government would not survive, like in the room where whoever is designated as a puppet sits with the Russian soldiers. That would be the extent of the puppet government, right? And it goes to sort of Putin's great miscalculation about Ukraine, because he really expected, from what we can, tell, that they would be greeted as liberators, and then they can install some sort of puppet regime, and they don't need to occupy it, and they would have Belarus #2. That's just not possible, right? So I think, and I'll end here, I think the only possibility is defeat of Putin. It's just as simple as that. There cannot be any sort of like settlement that would be in any way stable, where they could get something. I mean, maybe Crimea could be discussed in some sort of like as a settlement, but even eastern territories of Ukraine, which these quasi-republics claimed as theirs, people are rebelling there, right? They cannot control it in any kind of feasible way. So I think it's very important to think about. I think we're approaching what I would say probably a new Cold War. There would be an iron curtain somewhere. Whether or not, I mean, if Putin's regime falls, that could be a different thing. But I think if Putin's regime stays and they create some sort of North Korea and are able to stay in control, that iron curtain will fall. And I think it's the question where it will fall. And, as far as sort of the outcome for Ukraine, it would either be this continued humanitarian catastrophe and fighting literally every day, insurgency, concentration camps, all of this, or Putin will have to fail. So I think these are really the outcomes we're looking at. I'll end here. Thank you.
Indeed, on that note. So thank you so much to our panelists. I would like to invite you to share your thoughts and questions with us. If someone is ready to share one, please do. And if not yet, I'll pose a question myself. Oh, are you running up to the microphone or to the back? Okay, great. So please go ahead.
Thank you. This is absolutely fascinating, and I enjoy listening to you under these circumstances. At the international level, do you see any structural changes that might happen at that level? There have been instances of, I think it was Ukraine that was debating the legitimacy of Russia being on the Security Council because at the time, or a permanent member, because they were a permanent member under the Soviet Union, and they no longer are. Are there any, we have had instances at the Security Council of some of the permanent members taking action and then vetoing any resolutions against it. So do you see, and there is no mechanism that I'm aware of removing a permanent member from the Security Council. Are there any sort of structural changes at the international level that might be considered at this point, in the past 70 years to try to prevent something like this, or getting rid of permanent members on the Security Council, or anything else that could be done at the international level? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I don't know if anybody would like to take it up. Yeah, Mariana?
I mean, it's a great question. I actually don't have an answer. And if you meet someone who does, please let me know. I'd like to discuss it with them. But you raise a really critical point, is that our international life, international system is structured a certain way. That structure emerged out of the ashes of World War II. And yeah, there isn't a procedure for voting or suspending a permanent member of Security Council. It has been a perennial problem at the UN because a lot of the decisions are deadlocked, right? You can't take a decision if one of the perpetrators of something terrible like that is a veto member. So could there be some kind of General Assembly supermajority overriding mechanism? I think that's probably a very good thing to consider. But this is what I meant, that the world will emerge out of this, hopefully, with some very, very kind of crucial ideas about how to go forward, because this is unsustainable.
If I could just add to this, kind of without going into the the structure of the UN or any other organization, the real question here is whether or not agreements and commitments are honored. And we have seen in the recent 2 decades how many agreements and how many commitments Russia has violated. Russia did recognize Ukraine in its full territory following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia was one of the signatories of that infamous Budapest Memorandum, in which it was one of the assurers of Ukraine's sovereignty, and so on. There are countless examples of the various treaties and agreements that Russia has violated. Russia does not view international agreements as something binding, and the real question is how to deal with that. Thank you.
I would just 2 fingers on this. I agree. I think the dilemma that we have here, that the whole international order that sort of kept peace and stability and the certain principles is now being undermined by one of the major powers with nuclear weapons that's supposed to guarantee this very order. And I think that's a fundamental dilemma. I was on a panel earlier today, and one proposal was there that I didn't think about, but now sort of the more I think about it, the more it made sense to me, is that Russia not only needs to lose this, it needs to be denuclearized. Like if Putin stays in power. I mean, I know, like, we can say, how do you accomplish this? But if we are to solve this fundamental dilemma that we are now in, right, with one of the major guarantors of the system is blatantly violating it, right? Like, maybe that's something that we begin to think about. I mean, I don't mean be here at this table, but I mean,
Well, let's start
yeah,
thinking about it right now.
And maybe I'll take the moderator's privilege to offer just one other thought about this, which is that there are 2 events in 2021 that might seem unrelated to the crisis in Ukraine and the way it evolved into a war. One is the insurrection on January 6th in the US Capitol, and the other is the September withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, which was utterly chaotic, as we all know. I think as we think about the structural changes in the international system, the perception by many countries, not just Russia, but including Russia, that the West generally, but the United States in particular, has never been more obsessed with its own domestic divisions. The United States has never seemed less focused in the last 50 years on what's going on outside its own borders. And so whether there are institutional changes in the context of the United Nations, I think the broader sense that we're coming to the end of an era of American hegemony is part of the story of the timing of this. And so I would draw straight lines from January 2021, September 2021 to the situation in Ukraine. And then it may well be that if we think again systemically, if there's some conflict that involves China and Taiwan, we will probably draw a straight line from January 2021, September 2021 to February 2022 to whenever that moment is as well. So a fundamental reordering of the system, I think, is underway.
If I could also just add for something really brief to that, I think one important aspect of this, and I fully agree with Ravi, is also that the amount of support for Ukraine that comes on the grassroots level is equally unprecedented. And what it shows is that there is a thirst for moral leadership that we have not received globally on many of the issues that have been happening in various countries, not just in the US, but also elsewhere. And so people are, in fact, reclaiming that agency and making those decisions to show support and to do something on their own levels to the extent that it's possible for them because of that. And that, too, is another reordering, I think, of the kind of global political and activist system.
So saving the West as an idea from the ground up this time. Mark, I think you're next.
Just 2 quick things. One, Alexandra rightly emphasized that when sanctions become legislated, it's even more difficult to lift them. But what's been striking here, Alexandra, also though, is I think given the magnitude of the unlegislated sanctions, they're going to be very difficult. Just, when entire companies are pulling out, that have been operating there for 30 years or more, in the case of McDonald's, for them to feel that it's the right time to get back in, it's just going to be a lot harder. So I think that in that sense, maybe they, that they're less of an instrument to try to bring about change now than they might have been if it were easier to regulate them in a way that would try to calibrate behavior and if improvements result. So where I come down, I've been trying to think through about what Putin's objective is, and I have to say, I fully support what Oksana said. As I look back at history, I see what happened in Ukraine after the Second World War, from the mid-1940s through the early 1950s, even into the mid-1950s. It was a brutal counterinsurgency campaign the Soviet government waged. This was the Stalin-era campaign to try to consolidate Soviet rule over Western Ukraine. It was predominantly Western Ukraine, but it even affected regions around Kyiv. And it's a very ominous precedent, because in that counterinsurgency campaign, again, there's no definitive estimate of people killed, but it was around 150,000, which, given that the population of Ukraine then was considerably smaller than it is now, it's an ominous thing to think about where things may be heading, for all the reasons that you brought out, Oksana.
Thank you for sharing those reflections. Mark, I think we have another one up here. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Megan. I'm a divinity school student, and I've reported as a religion journalist on the Orthodox Schism. So I wanted to know from you guys, what role do you think the Russian Orthodox Church has played in disseminating the propaganda points? And specifically, what do you think is the potential for the Russian Orthodox Church to reverse a little bit the disinformation campaign? Because I saw there's about 300 Russian Orthodox bishops so far and priests that have signed a statement condemning the invasion and indirectly criticizing Kirill, which seemed very bold of them to do so. And then I also wondered, what role is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow playing in building some kind of more national unity in Ukraine, even among the two Ukrainian churches that have split? I think so far 12 out of 50 bishops in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church have actually come out and stopped recognizing Kirill as their authority. So I just wonder, what kind of impact is that having on the ground in Ukraine right now?
Fascinating question.
I
Oksana,
can speak
yes,
to that a little bit, because that's something that I study, on the Ukrainian part at least. I think as you know, in Ukraine, there has been these two competing Orthodox churches. One, the OCU, which was established with the Thomas from the Patriarch in Constantinople, right, which was primarily based on the Kiev Patriarchy, previously unrecognized so-called schismatic church, also Orthodox. And only, there was sort of attempt to unify, but of course the Moscow Patriarchy Church, the other church in unity was Russian Orthodox Church. Only a few priests from hierarchs from that church joined the new church, so basically the church divide continued. And now, of course, since Kirill in Russia came basically in support of the invasion, I think that really sent shockwaves and really puts kind of moment of reckoning for this Moscow-affiliated church in Ukraine. I don't think, I'm not an expert on Russian Orthodox Church within Russia, but from my perspective, I think that is very unlikely rather, that the Patriarch would change his position. The so-called symphony, between church and state in Russia. We can go into the Patriarch's sort of KGB past and all of this. So it seems like, yes, you're right, there is sort of small rebellion among a few priests. But the hierarchy that has been established there, both within the church itself and sort of this general power vertical and the close alignment between the state and the church, I think there would be some reckoning on the part of global orthodoxy, how would other churches respond? So that's sort of the answer to the first question. But the answer to the second question, this is something, I think that's yet another area. I think when all is said and done, and when Ukraine eventually wins, which I'm sure it will, I think it's more likely than not we will finally see the unification of these two churches into one. So Putin would end one of the few remaining societal divisions. Because exactly the processes that you mentioned, the the priests from the Moscow-affiliated church in Russia, in Ukraine, are coming out against the invasion. They, calling on the hierarchy in Ukraine to basically come out, very clearly against, basically break ties with Kirill, who endorses this invasion, right? The primate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy, Anufriy, he made sort of one mild statement. I don't think he has clearly broken with it, but from what I hear from people who study, religion, orthodoxy in Ukraine, there are very active kind of discussions. And I think it's just a matter of time before they'll probably be forced, to explicitly break with that. Then, of course, the question becomes what happens after that, because there is a lot of bad blood between these two competing Orthodox churches in Ukraine. So all this Moscow Patriarchy priests sort of joining the OCU, which their primate already offered, it hasn't happened. But so there may be some period of sort of negotiations and realignment, and depending also how global Orthodoxy responds. But I think, the profound irony here, that Putin is ending yet another division within Ukraine. So, yeah.
Yeah, Tom. Yeah.
A word about the Russian Orthodox Church. There was a statement from a group characterizing themselves as priests and deacons of the Russian Orthodox Church. An analogy for me is the different statements by the rectors of the major Russian universities, which was, in my view, outrageous in its support for the Russian effort to denazify Ukraine. Compare that to the statement from the Russian Academy of Sciences, which was more in the nature of hand-wringing and concern about humanitarianism. So the likelihood that the Russian Orthodox Church, in any way, shape, or form, which is so deeply compromised politically, would oppose this or mobilize any kind of popular pressure against Russia's war, to me, those chances are negligible.
We have seen already how the Russian Church has acted on the territories that Russia has occupied. So that's the certain areas of the Donbass and Luhansk oblasts, as well as the Crimea. So Stanislav Aseyev, the journalist, in his book, he describes episodes about how subservient the Russian Orthodox Church is to the state or whoever is in power. So there are episodes, for example, when one of the warlords walks into the church. The priest stops the service and then reverently acknowledges the presence of this warlord, and then continues with a sermon in which he speaks how valiantly they fight against the dark forces, and so on. And then a whole other story about the celebration of May 1st, when they were actually celebrating Easter, and only later realized that it's actually May 1st. So all of this shows you already have already certain examples of that happening already on the ground in those areas, and that's only bound to continue if Russia is to take control of more of Ukraine.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, thanks. I have a follow-up question on the energy sanctions points that you made, Alexandra. My name is Benjamin Schmidt. I'm from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. First, on the in terms of energy dependence, I really am glad that you pointed out the structural dependencies that have been built up over time. Obviously, since 2015, with the European Energy Union concept, where the EU, to a greatest extent, was trying to diversify specifically away from from Russian energy resources. Most of Central and Eastern Europe took solid steps on that front, whereas Germany and other Western European nations have basically taken a structural approach to continue and deepen their energy dependency. Thankfully, Nord Stream 2 was sanctioned and ended and went bankrupt, and all 106 employees were fired last week, so that chapter is over. But I just want to point out that there are steps that can be taken right now to help increase pressure on the Kremlin while making more resilient the energy ability and flexibility in the next several months. Number one, that there's a lot of European gas storages across Central Europe that are owned by Gazprom, either part owner and part of joint ventures. That's number one. Number two, deployment of floating storage and regasification units. These are basically mobile LNG terminals. The structural issue with that is that even if you bring these up to the coastline at places like Gdansk, Poland, or Brunsbüttel, Germany, you still need to build the onshore infrastructure, and I think we need a wartime level of effort to actually build that out. And so yes, whereas we are not going to see Europe taking the steps that the Biden administration took yesterday to end hydrocarbon resources, I think that's something that needs to be taken as a structural step. I think the EU has kind of hinted at that, but by 2030, which is the goal that that the EU DG Energy announced yesterday, is it's a little bit too long, and I think we can do better in the short term. The question I have based on that is another structural area that's been an issue and basically aiming at undermining Western political cohesion since before 2014, but certainly over the past 8 years during the Nord Stream saga and the rest of all of the controversies that have had to do with elite capture. In other words, former Western senior officials specifically stepping out of office and taking jobs for authoritarian state-owned enterprises. Gerhard Schroeder is obviously the titular Schroederization of this trend, but we've seen Karen Kneissl, former Austrian foreign minister, working for Rosneft. We've seen Francois Fillon working for Russian state-owned oil and gas trading company. We've seen a number of other Austrian officials taking jobs for Nord Stream 2 AG, which again is now liquidated. So my question is this. Since the last 2 weeks, we've seen Francois Fillon resign. We've seen a few people from BP, although I would not put them in the same category as they weren't former political leaders, Bob Dudley and others, right? But we've seen Karen Kneissl and Gerhard Schroeder very publicly, in his case, speaking out and saying, no, I won't be moving away from my position. Is there a point that we need to deploy further legislative actions on a transatlantic basis, something that maybe in this country could be called the SHAME Act, the Stop Helping America's Malign Enemies Act, to really get this going? Because if the lowercase shame doesn't work, maybe we have a legislative acronym SHAME that will. So that's my question.
Thank you for your questions. We're fortunate that our distinguished moderator happens to be an expert on energy issues, so I think I'm going to ask him to answer this question.
So I'll just share a few thoughts, and I love the cleverness of your legislative acronym. We will. I didn't write down your name when you said it, but
it's in Foreign Policy Magazine.
Yeah.
From
Okay.
last week.
Great. So we will credit you as well. I think one of the underlying theories about the energy relationship between Europe and Russia, and by that I think we should be clear, it's mostly Germany and Russia, France and Russia, and Italy and Russia, as opposed to the European Union and Russia. And so the lack of European unity on these issues is, I think, one of the primary challenges that Europe as a political space has faced over these past years. The underlying theory from, let's say, the German perspective or the French or Italian perspective was always that the story of European dependence on Russian gas in particular. Oil is a very different story since oil is a global commodity. It just goes on markets, more or less. Whereas gas is a very intimate relationship, especially when it's pumped through pipelines and pipeline infrastructures that last for a long time. The theory was, we are, yes, dependent on Russian gas, but not as dependent as the Russian state is on European energy markets to finance its core activities. So because the dependence is mutual, it's genuine interdependence, we are both constrained in this kind of intimate way. I think that one of the fascinating elements of this crisis, and this goes again perhaps to some of Oksana's paradoxes, President Putin's achieving exactly the opposite of what he wanted, was that we will probably have never seen as much European unity and unity of action on these issues as will have resulted from precisely this. And to Alexandra's point about the non-deterrability of the Russian Federation's president, the Russian president knew very well that very, very well, and in crystal clear terms, that a consequence of invading Ukraine would be that there would be an $11 billion pipe underneath the Baltic Sea that might never be used. And if he were willing to give up that, with that certainty, then there's almost no sanction that we could imagine that would have deterred the Russian president from pursuing further actions. Now, on the specific question, I think actually that shame in lowercase is likely to be very effective in the coming years. And I would certainly welcome an effort for shame as an acronym to be pursued. But the consequences of the toxicity of relationships with powerful entities that are close to the Kremlin, I think for a different generation, a non-Schroeder generation, are going to look very, very different. And Schroeder's like old school, and I don't know exactly how old he is, but he comes from a totally different era. If we think about political elites leaving the establishment and going into private practice of sorts, selling their networks, I think it looks very, very different for the next generation, because the consequences of this war are going to be so enormous in terms of Russia's isolation. That doesn't mean it's not a good idea. I think it's a great idea, and I wouldn't be surprised if there were efforts to do that. But I think lowercase shame is actually going to work a lot more thoroughly than it has been over the past few years.
Very briefly and not entirely flippantly, I agree with what Rawi is saying about lowercase shame. It's proven quite effective in American domestic politics in isolating and, in a way, shaming some of the politicians who had been so vociferous in their support for Putin's genius and so on and so on. For the same reason, an uppercase shame act is like many other acts like an International Criminal Court, or it runs afoul of domestic divisions in places like the United States that are so polarized, as Rawi mentioned. The decentralized from below form of shame that Rawi is mentioning has proven to be quite remarkably powerful and concerted.
Did we have another question, or were you just, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Betsy Fawcett, and I'm at the Graduate School of Education. And I spent 2 years living and teaching in Ukraine. And like quite literally, I'm here because of my colleagues and my friends who are in Ukraine. And so just kind of, working through that. But I have kind of a personal question and then more of an academic question. The personal question is, what can we be doing here at Harvard, but also as academics? I'm feeling very lost in like what I can be doing that's effective here. And then when I was in Ukraine, I did a lot of teaching around misinformation and how to spot misinformation. And I'm finding that a lot of what I taught my students is not working anymore because things have gotten that much, it's just better. The Russian propaganda is just better. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions about how you as academics kind of filter through good information and bad information, and what we can kind of share with other people about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are world-saving kinds of questions.
Well, I think it's important that the questions are linked, right? Fighting misinformation and disinformation is something that everybody in this room can do and is essential. So I've been talking a lot with a lot of my own friends and people that I know and have been working with in Ukraine, and that is one of the things that they are telling me every time I talk to them. Share good, verified information and get it to audiences that otherwise don't think this affects them, because it, not only do people want to make sure that what is happening is known to the world, they also, and I mean, on the ground, the daily things that Ukrainians are going through right now, but they also want people to know that this isn't going to end with Ukraine. It has to be seen as a global issue. So sharing good information, and I would say, our institute put together a resource page that includes a lot of great people and great initiatives and great journalistic outlets in Ukraine and otherwise that you can follow. One thing I started doing during the Euromaidan when information was chaos and no one knew anything that was happening, that's when I curated a Twitter feed of people who were verified as being good at giving you good information. And as much as Twitter is a toxic place, that still works. There's people you can follow on the ground who are giving out good information, and that's really important. And fighting misinformation. I mean, the level, I think the level of sophistication of certain tactics of Kremlin propaganda, it's not just about the content itself, it's the type of tactics that are designed to make people reading news in English question what they think they're seeing. It's designed to throw them off of the things that matter the most. Those are Kremlin tactics that have been tested over time that we're seeing play out right now. So I do think this is really important. I think it's a challenge because the Kremlin has been a step ahead for a really long time in terms of the information war, and we're starting to see it come to a head. I mean, I truly believe that information is one of the fronts of this war. So that's kind of the answer to that. I mean, it's complicated, and verified good information is the main thing. And we're seeing, one of the great ironies that I've been thinking about is Ukraine being at the forefront of some of the best technology in terms of creating fake images and fake speech, or I should say artificial images and speech, not fake. Ukrainians are doing some of that, and now that's some of the stuff that's being used to create fake. So it's really, I don't know, something to think about. As somebody who did, experience, my dissertation research started in September of 2013, and then 2 months later, Euromaidan protests started, and I would really just say on a personal level, it's not time to think academically. You have to give yourself a break. Like, you can't analyze something that is different every 5 minutes. You can't do it. And it's gonna actually, it can be harmful because you'll be reacting to something, trying to explain something, and then find yourself having, come to a wrong conclusion. So I think it's really important not to sort of rush into feeling like we need to be our regular academic selves at this moment. I think that can be really detrimental, actually. It took me a really long time to, write a dissertation about these protests because it was, happening at the time I was supposed to be writing it. So anyway, just as a personal note, I think that's really important. And just as an ad, the resource page that we have also has places where you can donate, that sort of thing, where you can write to your representatives, et cetera. So other types of actions that you can do, that's all available on our crisis resource.
The other thing is that some of the international centers, the Ukrainian Research Institute, the Davis Center, the Center for European Studies, the Weatherhead Center, we've created a fund to support student events that are related to Ukraine. So the Center for European Studies will have a form, I think they already have a form actually, where students can submit ideas for different events or speakers or something like that, and we really encourage everyone to take advantage of that. If you have an idea for some way to get more information, get more events, get people involved, we really want to support that.
Can I just add a couple of thoughts to that? I think one thing that's very important is to support academic communities in Ukraine, right? Because I think these initiatives that, people can come as like scholars at risk, right, for this place, spend the semester here, that's important. But if you listen to academics and scholars in Ukraine, researchers, they want to keep working. They want their networks, their institutions to keep working. And I think one thing academic institutions in the US could do is to consider not only severing ties with the Russian academic institutions that this process already began, but building ties with Ukrainian academic institutions, right? I mean, there is a lot of, cutting-edge research people published in, recognized international journals, so it's not really charity. I mean, this is really intellectual exchange. I mean, I was just, Alexandra, just so you know, I was moderating a panel from the Kyiv School of Economics today. They're actually looking for Western universities to sign with them this memorandum of understanding. They're not expecting, that you would start sort of any kind of actual programming, but for them it's an important symbolic step, right? That if international, scholarly centers abroad would, sort of acknowledge that they want to cooperate with them. I think some sort of decolonization, for the lack of a better word, I think in many Russian and Slavic studies department is in order. I'm sorry to say, but I mean, I think, of course, I don't want to equate some sort of, Russocentric or Russophilic views in Western academia with Russian propaganda, but the truth of the matter is that there is a lot of sort of looking, at history and at present time through kind of like pro-Russian eyes. I think this is something that needs to be reconsidered. It could involve, additional courses, it could involve adjusting syllabi, but I think this idea, that, let's be honest, right? I mean, this sort of whole myth about like three united Slavic nations, so forth, many Westerns kind of like think maybe that's not really exactly wrong, right? Of course, historians on Ukraine have been sort of fighting against that narrative for a long time, maybe not getting as far as they should be. So I think this kind of rethinking of the Slavic studies, not just with regard to Ukraine, but with regard to any kind of so-called smaller states, right? I think that would be another thing. And the third thing that I would mention, I think, academic institutions, they have, especially the ones with large endowment, they are invested in various, firms and mutual funds and so forth. I think reviewing those and see if there are any companies in these, right? That was done during apartheid when there was, to kind of punish South African apartheid regime. I think that's a perfect parallel here. I think it's not going to happen in one day. For the company, it's maybe a quicker decision. You decide to stop operations. If you're talking about university with multi-million endowment, to see like where is this money going, right? And vetting their investments accordingly would be another thing to do.
I think Yale actually announced that they divested today.
They already did. Yeah, good for them.
So if I may just to add a few things. Maybe starting with Oksana's latest point, I think what you can do and what every student or academically involved person can do in this country or even in other countries is to urge the administrators of your university, of your school, to examine the kind of connections they have with Russian state-sponsored organizations as well as oligarchs that are close to Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. We know at Harvard that there is a very close connection with Len Blavatnik, for example. The fact that he sponsors a whole prize in innovation at Harvard Business School, the fact that there's a whole kind of accelerator for life sciences with Harvard Medical School, and so on and so forth. And he is someone who has benefited tremendously from the close ties to Vladimir Putin, who has engaged in repression of free speech and other issues, has produced films, with anti-Ukrainian harmful propaganda to create an image of Ukraine inside Russia and abroad that is damaging. So all of these things and examples are honestly, manifold. So let's encourage our administrators and, at Harvard, at Tufts, at Yale, at other universities to honestly dissociate themselves from these corrupt individuals. They're damaging our reputation and they are laundering, their name using us, trying to gain a seat at the table. Then the next thing I think that is really important is the issue of decolonizing Slavic studies, because they're Slavic just in name. The absolute majority of Slavic studies in the Anglophone world, but also elsewhere, is Russian studies. And so just as German studies, and I speak as someone who, my first degree was in German studies. German studies was not the same after World War II as it was before. Russian studies and Slavic studies cannot exclude chauvinistic and imperialist motives and sides of Russian culture. We cannot teach Pushkin without teaching things about him that are not so nice. We cannot teach Bulgakov without teaching his his whole Ukrainian phobia, and so on. So we need to re-examine, what we are doing and how we are teaching these things. Yes, and finally, on the misinformation issue, I think that the whole COVID pandemic and the this flourishing of misinformation and various manipulations have shown is that trusted sources, people that are really of prime importance. People were not willing to get vaccinated when someone from TV told them to do so, but when their doctor that they have known for 20, 30 years told them, no, you are getting vaccinated, that's it, then they got vaccinated. So I think the same approach in fighting all of this misinformation is probably going to work.
All right. Well, I know that we have several more questions, and I suspect that our panelists would be happy to stay a little bit longer to speak with those of you who would like to ask questions or share reflections. But I do want to be mindful of the time and bring the formal event to a close, and then the rest of the event can be more informal, gathered around here. I want to thank all of you for your expressions of commitment for Ukraine and for humanity by being here. I want to thank my dear colleagues for spending their evening with us and sharing their thoughts. I'd like to remind all of you that there are lots of services available to the community for further support, of which I think we all need some. For undergraduates, the resident deans, mental health services, chaplaincy, and always we are available to you as well. The Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, the Davis Center, Center for European Studies, the Weatherhead Center, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, notwithstanding the colonialism. We will continue to engage with this horrific challenge in the weeks and months ahead, and there will be other events, but you should not hesitate to reach out to us for advice about how to find the support that you need, or for thoughts you want to share with us, or for reactions that you think we all should hear. So please do keep an eye out for other ways that we can continue to build our community, and in many ways, never more important than now, given the potential divisions among us. And I will close just with one more hopeful note, and perhaps a little bit related to the information wars. One of the things that has been both fascinating and heartening to me is how the Ukrainians have won the hearts and minds of the West so very thoroughly during this conflict. And for all of the vaunted information capabilities of the Russian services, they have lost quite dramatically. And with iconic catchphrases, which I think will resonate not just throughout 2022, but beyond and as long as the conflict lasts, which have to do, if you haven't noticed, you certainly should look it up, what the Russian warship should do to itself. So with that, I am pleased to, again, stand with the people of Ukraine, and delighted that the Ukrainians have been so heroic both within their country, but so effective at making their case to the world that this is important and it's not just about Ukraine. So thank you for spending your evening with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.